Thanks, everybody. I had a moment of slight panic there when I saw I didn't change my first slide, so my apologies for that. But it's great to be here and to have an opportunity to speak to you today. And I think obviously a very timely opportunity to talk as well, as we're seeing the changes that are happening and coming down the tracks with the Assisted Decision Making Act. What I really want to do maybe today is provide a little bit of a bridging piece, because I think one of the realities is for autism and autistic people in recent years, there's been a massive increase in awareness, and the size of our identified community has grown substantially. But what I think we have to maybe understand is that awareness is only the first step in the process, but B, even actually the fact-finding piece is only the second step. That we can actually have all of the facts we want to have about autism if we aren't able to empathise with the experiences of autistic people. And I suppose in having that empathy, understand the sorts of factors that might be influencing a person's ability to make decisions and be influencing a person's decision to be or a person's ability to be autonomous in day-to-day life. That's where a lot of problems can emerge. So that's what I'm going to really try and do today, is to really, I suppose, help you step into the shoes of an autistic person, see the world a little bit through an autism lens. And as we do that, kind of call out, I suppose, some of the practical areas and considerations that might be useful when we talk about positive risk-taking. So I suppose just to begin by giving a little bit of an explanation of myself, the picture in the top left-hand corner is a picture of me before I joined Weight Watchers. And my mother always says about me that I never do anything until I'm ready, and then I do it very quickly. And that started at birth because I was 20 days overdue, and then I was born in 25 minutes. And I'm told that babies usually lose weight before they leave the hospital, but I actually gained weight, and they used to bring in 2 bottles and say, these are for the twins. And the reason that is relevant to the story is from the moment I was born, I developed a huge attachment to my mother. So she couldn't put me out of her arms for more than a couple of minutes without me screaming the house down. And of course, at first you just think, well, this is a difficult baby, and there's lots of difficult babies. But I didn't actually sleep for more than a few hours a night or in my own bed until I was 7 years old. And if you think about, I suppose, the sorts of things you might look out for in a young child, the first time they walk, the first time they talk, the first time they play with other children, all of those things worked quite differently for me. So, for example, I had sentences by my first birthday. I could say, Santa, bring me car by my first birthday. But the way I understood language was exactly as it was spoken or exactly as it was written down. And if you interpret language in this way, Ireland is the worst possible country that you can be born into. Because very often we try to be so polite, we take all meaning out of language and cause a huge amount of distress and confusion as a result. My own grandmother was alive until I was 10 years old. And my great-grandmother, I should say, she was in her 90s. And when I was about 2, she said to me one day, "You're a lovely boy, I'd love to take you home with me." So I ran away from her screaming. And if we saw her at weddings or funerals or anything like that for the next number of years, I'd go crazy and I'd go and hide. And my mum would say, well, why are you doing that? I'd say, because she wants to kidnap me. And when Mum would try and explain that that's not what she'd meant, I would think about that and I'd say, oh, okay, so is she a liar then? Because I couldn't understand why anyone would say something that they didn't in fact mean. My coordination was very different to other people, so I didn't crawl when I should have been walking. I would talk and talk and talk about the things that I was interested in, but only the things that I was interested in. So to put that in context, when I started preschool, the thing that I was most interested in the world was Tutankhamun, and he wasn't very popular the year I started preschool. So it was very hard for me to make friends with other people. I also liked to always have the rules and to know what was going to happen next. And obviously if you're playing with other children, the rules change all of the time. And as I'll talk a little bit further about later on in the presentation, the way my sensory system works is very different to other people. So as a result, going to places like a restaurant, like a family party, like a birthday party where there's lots of people talking at once, there's lots of different food, that would have been totally overwhelming and undoable for me. And as a result, there was a long list of places we weren't able to go to as a family. So at the time, there wasn't the level of awareness of autism that there is now. So I spent the first 3 years of my education in a special school, segregated from my community, not able to access the same curriculum as other people. And thankfully, the system slowly began to change. So when I was 8 years old, I moved to a local national school and had a special needs assistant for 5 years. The same special needs assistant. And then when I was a teenager, I transitioned to secondary school independently. But I suppose the question that I get asked, probably the most about all questions by different people, parents, professionals, other autistic people, it's when did you find out you were autistic? How should I tell someone in my family that they are autistic? If I'm an autistic adult, should I share that information with other people in my life? And I always have to be really honest and say that, there's no eureka moment for me. There's no one moment whereby people are able to say that was the day I found out that I was autistic, because from a very young age, mom was having me assessed, and from a very young age, mom would say things like, you know the way you know all the flags of the world, but you know the way you don't like busy places, we call that autism. So it was something spoken about in a completely normal and positive way from the time I was young. And when I moved to mainstream school, they actually did work educating the 7 and 8-year-olds in my class to understand what that experience was going to be like moving into a busy mainstream classroom. So it was always something we were open about. But by the time I was 11 and I became a little bit more maybe self-aware, people start to ask you questions. They begin to ask you, why does that lady sit beside you in class all day? Or why do you leave our classroom for an hour every day when we're doing Irish? And suddenly you begin to maybe understand a little bit more what it actually means to be different, what this label within society of autism actually means and what's its impact. And certainly by the time I was a kind of preteen, I began to notice that if people knew you were autistic, you might just notice them speaking a little bit slower to you. Or sometimes you might notice people doing what my dad does if he goes on a foreign holiday and speak just a little bit louder to you. And I don't think it's because people want to be disrespectful. I think it's actually because people want to be very inclusive. But if you look at the journey that we've kind of gone from segregation towards inclusion in the community, which kind of roughly, I think, follows the course of my life, one of the things that I think is quite interesting is we've done it in a really Irish way, which is we say, let's move autistic people into the community, but let's not talk about it. And the consequence is that so many of the barriers autistic people face come from that lack of understanding. But also from a very young age, what happens for many autistic people is a loss of self-esteem as well, and a massive, massive stigma. And what that stigma does is it means that people can be very reluctant to share their diagnosis, including with other healthcare practitioners, because the response can sometimes be things like, but you don't look autistic, or, oh, it must be very mild, or a jumping maybe to immediately disempower somebody because of their diagnosis. So I guess when I was 16, I began to socialise and make friends for the first time, and I was in a point by the time I was finishing school that my parents or myself even probably wouldn't have foreseen, even maybe 2 or 3 years before that point, in that I was independent within the school system, I was happy, and I'd made friends. But around the same time that that was happening, I was having this coming to terms with my own diagnosis that I will talk a little bit about again in a moment. But what I began to notice is if you have an autism diagnosis in Ireland, it's a little bit like being a member of a secret society. And by that I mean you know everybody else in your community who has an autism diagnosis. From a very young age, you've gone to the same support groups, you've gone to the same schools, your parents know each other. But as you get a little bit older and perhaps a little bit more independent, or perhaps it's not so much that you've become more independent, but there isn't the supports that you actually need as an adult that maybe were there when you were a child, people don't always share their diagnosis for a variety of reasons. And one of the impacts of that is that I would have observed as a teenager that other autistic people, even that I would have known in the community, the words people would use to describe them were, he's weird, he's odd, he's strange. And I really wanted to do something to change that. So 8 years ago, when I was doing my Leaving Cert, I set up AsIAm, and today we've grown to be Ireland's national autism charity. So we're a team of 27 people, half of whom are autistic or neurodivergent. And our vision is to bring about an autism-friendly Ireland. That's a society where every autistic person is accepted as they are, equal, valued and respected. And really, we believe to get there, what we have to do is capacity building. So what we mean is, on the one hand, we have to provide supports to autistic people and family members, but critically what we have to do is see autism through the prism of accessibility and actually look at how we can make our schools, our healthcare settings, our communities more autism friendly and remove some of those barriers that exist. So to just give you a couple of examples of our work, as of the last 6 months or so, we're now a grant-aided Section 39 body, so we operate an autism information line. It's open Monday to Thursdays, 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. And people can access that by phone, or because for many autistic people the phone is very overwhelming, people can also use email or instant messaging. And this year we will be expecting to receive about 5,000 calls, many from autistic adults and the parents of autistic adults, facing a wide variety of challenges. And that can be anything from somebody who might be struggling with a particular issue in their life and they're looking for guidance around it, through to maybe somebody facing a barrier to accessing their supports or their rights within the community. So some people, the average call time is about 20 minutes. Some people will get that information and that will be it. But about 1,000 people then will receive further supports. So we provide a wide range of group-based supports. Since last October, 1,000 autistic adults have accessed support through our adult social groups and wellbeing programs. And that's everything from quite heavy spaces like women's groups and men's groups where people can come and talk through their experiences, through to an autistic choir that meets online once a month, an autistic book club, an autistic creative writing club. So it's really about creating that space where the person can feel safe and can access support from their peers free of charge. The other area, I suppose, of our work that is what makes, I think, AsIAm quite unique is this work we do around accessibility. So to just give you a couple of examples of that, we have a program in universities where we're trying to remove the barriers to participation for people in higher education and after higher education transitioning into work. We started that project, which was a global first, in DCU back in 2015. And at the time, DCU was a university of 16,000 students, and there was 30 people on the books as being autistic. And we knew that couldn't be right. So we sent the survey about your experience at college to every autistic student, or every student, I should say, in the university, and said, confidentially, if you are autistic, will you answer this? And 54% of respondents who answered the survey had never told anyone on campus that they had a diagnosis. They were experiencing the same sorts of challenges that other people were facing, but because of their experiences in school accessing support, because of their fears of being kind of othered or treated differently, they didn't tend to share that information. And as a result, we've worked really intensively. We developed a framework for universities to become autism friendly, and we've been now rolling that out across the country. We also have an autism-friendly towns project, and what the towns project is all about is, imagine if instead of living in a community where you didn't feel understood from a young age, what would it be like if from a very young age you got a message from your community that you were valued, that you were included, that people were willing to make small tweaks to meet you halfway. So that started with training 150 organisations, everybody from the Butcher to the Gardaí to the GA Club in Clonakilty back in 2018. And now we're at a point where this year we're going to be working with 20 communities across the country. And I suppose just one of the reasons why I think that particular piece of work is relevant to the discussion that we're having today is obviously it's very important that in terms of decision support services, that those services will be trained, will be resourced to be able to do their job effectively. But actually, if we really want to support autistic people in decision making, that work needs to start an awful lot earlier as well, in terms of giving people the knowledge to understand their needs, to understand their rights, and the tools to communicate that. But critically, we need to do that not inside just the formal decision-making processes, but we actually need to do that within the community. It's things like resourcing autistic groups, autistic organisations, supporting young people when they're still in school to learn and train in self-advocacy. Because what very often happens at the moment, and this I certainly would align with my own experiences, what happens is right up until you're 18 years of age, your parents can do all of your advocacy work for you. And I went to a school that was really, really good. So the moment I had the smallest problem, mom would pick up the phone and the problem would be resolved. Because if I'm stressed about something, I often let it become a big problem instead of addressing it when it's a small problem. But then what happens is once you walk out the gates of school, everybody assumes that you know how to do that for yourself, even though you've never had that experience before. And in our experiences, that transition after school is really, really hard for autistic adults because people often haven't been resourced to identify what their needs are, identify what their rights are, and to know who and where and how when problems emerge. So I suppose just to give a little bit of an explanation for people who may not be familiar with autism in a day-to-day space, when we talk about autism, we're talking about a lifelong developmental condition that relates to how a person communicates and interacts with others and how they experience the world around them. That's a lot of words, but I often feel it doesn't really help us to bridge that gap and stand in the shoes of an autistic person. What I think is interesting is how big a community of people we are talking about. So it's not that long ago when autism was seen as something relatively rare, something that people might come across once or twice in their career, to a point where up until a couple of months ago when we spoke about the school system, we were talking about 1 in 65 children. In the last month, the Department of Education has indicated they now think that figure is more like somewhere around the 3.3% mark. So 3.3% of children in the school system having a diagnosis of autism. And these young people are the first generation of young people who have been diagnosed as children in large numbers who are aging out of the school system now and have expectations to be included in the community, but will face barriers around that transition as well. What I think is interesting is when we talk about autism as a spectrum, for a long time people like to think about it as a really neat line, and they actually thought you could kind of plot yourself as to where you were on the spectrum. And of course, the hideous thing about that that's very relevant to the discussion here today is that for a long time what basically happened was an autistic person who had a degree of independence never received any support that they needed. There was a certain idea that, you know, if you were an autistic person and you were verbal, well, you must have some sort of superpower. You can probably count cards or, you know, hear things before they happen. So you don't need any support. But then on the other hand, if you were an autistic person who was perhaps didn't use words to communicate or perhaps had higher support needs that were visible to people, there was a certain glass ceiling that was placed on your head right away. And I think this is particularly relevant when we consider that most of the research in autism, for most of the history of autism, has really focused on white middle-class boys. So our ideas of autism are so fixed in that regard as well. But where the idea of a spectrum is really important in the concept of assisted decision-making is that it's not a linear process, that actually we're talking about people with very, very scattered skill sets. So everybody has strengths and weaknesses, but for most people they're quite close together, or rounded. For those of us who are autistic, they can be very, very pronounced. And that means you can meet autistic people who on the surface can appear very, very independent, but in another area of their life it can be incredibly overwhelming, whether that's things like managing household bills or managing relationships. You can meet another autistic person who might really struggle to engage, but actually in many aspects of their life the person might be very independent. So there is no one size fits all with autism, and perhaps the greatest barrier for many people is that we make so many general statements about autism that really, when you scratch just below the surface, don't really hold any weight at all. So fundamentally, we're talking about a community of people that have differences in communication, differences in thought processes, differences in how the environment is perceived, and all of these will impact and influence how you make decisions on a day-to-day basis. And I suppose one of the things is that if you're constantly dealing with the unknown, which is very much the experience many of us who are autistic have on a day-to-day basis, the reality is nobody likes to feel like they're dealing with the unknown. So I often go back to the idea of your first day in work, if you can think of where you started a new job, or your first day in school. And if you can multiply that and imagine for an autistic person, every day can feel a little bit like that, feeling on the back foot, waiting to get something wrong, and trying to just limit all of the unpredictability that is out there. And when you're feeling stressed like that, that increases obviously anxiety, and it makes doing day-to-day tasks a lot more challenging as well. So I suppose in AsIAm, how we try and put this across is that we need to get away from a deficit-based view of autism. It doesn't respect the idea of a scattered skill set for a start, but also actually, I think from the point of view of decision-making, it straight away adds a values judgment to how autistic people behave, to how autistic people communicate. And unfortunately, even today, a lot of the therapies and supports that are in place for autistic people still really try and actually teach an autistic person to be a neurotypical person, instead of at a very young age validating the experiences a person has and supporting the person as they are in the community to navigate the community and context that they live in. So in AsIAm, we like to think of it a little bit differently. We like to think about it more like two different mobile phones. Some of us use iPhone, some of us use Android. They're both pretty powerful devices and they both have their place and function. So I suppose what is interesting in this regard is, where does the barrier actually come from? And when we talk about Ireland ratifying the UN Convention, we know we have to get away from this medicalised view and model of autism. And in AsIAm, we try and talk about autism as an accessibility barrier. So when we think about accessibility, we tend to think about things like the width of doors, and is there wheelchair ramps, and is there lifts? But there's invisible barriers to how the world works that can pose major challenges for autistic people. And, you know, I think there's a way that we know it's an accessibility barrier that I think is quite important. We know that a massive percentage of autistic young people are still bullied during the course of their time in school. We know that 8 in 10 autistic people will experience a mental health condition over the course of their lives, and that an autistic person without an intellectual disability is 9 times more likely to die by suicide. We know that autistic people are 4 times more likely to experience social isolation than non-autistic people, and perhaps of any community in the country, an unemployment or an underemployment rate of 85%. Now, the reason that this is really important is to get an adult autism diagnosis, you don't have to be unemployed, you don't have to be unhappy, you don't have to not have friends or not be included in your community. They're all things that are happening to autistic people. And when autistic people ring our information line, these are the sorts of issues that they tend to be talking about. And so in AsIAm, how do we change that? Well, we try and look at it. And I think in terms of supporting people with decision making, these are relevant considerations as well. Where are the barriers in how we give, get and understand information? How is information available? How can a person choose to communicate? How does the non-autistic person interpret the information that's provided to them by the autistic person? Predictability and control. How do I know what's going to happen next? And what are my choices in terms of how that evolves? Sensory processing. When I'm communicating with other people, when I'm being asked to make decisions, how is the environment influencing me at that time? And is the environment supporting me or hindering me? And critically, the judgment and attitude of other people. And that is a really, really big area. And I think sometimes people just throw it in as something that we know people aren't aware enough. But we consistently survey autistic adults and families in Ireland, and consistently the single biggest barrier that people point to is judgment and attitude. And that often starts very small. Still, the most kind of classic example we get given when we talk to the parents of children is, I go to the supermarket and my child is really overwhelmed and they're working so hard to get through that experience, and then they have a meltdown and everyone just looks at me in terms of, gosh, would that person not just mother their children a little bit more stricter? They're just bold. And then that escalates to the point when you're an autistic adult and you go for a job interview and you've all the knowledge, but you choose not to make eye contact because it's the easier way to communicate for you, so people think you're being unsociable. So these judgment and attitude barriers are very real, and there's a huge unconscious bias that people can have that they don't even realise that can inform, I suppose, how people will view, can a person make decisions, can a person live independently. So the way I think it's important to think about this is really the UN Convention helps us to understand it. So how we must see disability is the personal characteristics, that thing you might see, a person who's very, very distressed maybe, but how they're interacting with the environmental and attitudinal barriers. And it's a little bit like an iceberg. The personal characteristic is often the bit we see and the bit we focus on, but really often what's bringing it to the surface is a whole lot of other factors as well, and they sometimes get lost in the discussion. So how I suppose try and explain this is the concept of a double empathy problem. So for a very long time, the literature around autism was really about treating autistic people as if they were broken neurotypical. So it was really about saying, isn't it so sad autistic people don't understand us? But ironically, what people perhaps didn't have the self-awareness to do was, but I don't really understand what the autistic person's experiencing either. So it's this double empathy piece that, yes, autistic people might need to be supported to understand the neurotypical world, neurotypical people, but actually critically, neurotypical people will often need a lot of support to understand the experiences an autistic person's having as well. And how I like to think about this is a culture, because we know all around the world there's people who communicate differently to us, who live in different environments to us, who structure their lives in a different way than most of us choose to here in Ireland. But we don't tend to really think that's a good or a bad thing. We see it as diversity. We like to go on our holidays and see these different cultures. And I suppose what it really comes back to is the word normal, because this word normal has done so much damage in terms of we want everyone to fit very neatly into, well, this is the right way to do things. But if you actually go around the room about any idea of normal and interview everyone in the room, everyone's idea of what's normal is slightly different. So if we just think about how you got here this morning, whether you used the train, whether you lived locally and you were able to walk or cycle, whether you drove, whatever your commute here was this morning, hopefully it was normal. So I want to show you a totally normal commute in Tokyo. It's a little bit different to a normal commute in Limerick. I think you're going to find it funny or a little bit grimacing. And the difference in how you respond to this and how the people in the video respond is what I'm going to use to just try and, I suppose, develop that empathy. So we'll just watch this closely together. those men definitely aren't afraid of positive risk taking anyway. But what I find interesting is when I show it, people tend to laugh a lot at it. But what I often say to people is go back and watch it a second time, and you'll find a load of clips like this on YouTube. Because it's only when you watch it the second time what you begin to notice is the people in the clip, unlike you, aren't reacting at all. They're actually really standing there and making themselves be pushed onto the train. Because if you grow up in this culture and go to work every day in this city, that is normal to you. But it's not normal to you or I. So can you imagine in the morning, if without any warning, any explanation, any context, you were picked up and dropped onto one of these trains and the doors closed? Imagine that amount of people in your personal space, totally claustrophobic. Maybe one person's wearing really cheap, overpowering perfume is pushed up against you. Maybe the next person had garlic for their dinner the night before, didn't brush their teeth. And all of this is coming at you at once. And when the train pulls in, everyone else knows exactly where to go. You know, you've probably all had that experience where you arrive in work in the morning and you've no idea how you got there. You know, it's the muscle memory driving the car. And it's a little bit like that for in this scenario. Everyone else knows exactly where they're going, but you've no idea even where the exit of the train station is or where you're meant to go next. Even if you speak the language, it might feel like when you're on holidays, people are talking very quickly to you. In different cultures, how people use their faces is very different. So you're not sure, is this person helpful or annoyed I'm stopping them? You're not sure, are they being sarcastic or are they giving you the information that you need? So maybe you look around and see, is there signs on the wall I can follow? And if I follow those signs, I'll know that I'm moving in the right direction. But even if one arrow sign is missing, you'll go right back to square one, because things that are obvious to most people won't be obvious to you, because you're living in a world or a culture that isn't built with you in mind. Now, if you can understand this, I think you can go a long way towards understanding the sorts of barriers autistic people face in Ireland on a day-to-day basis. And I like this analogy for a few reasons. As I said, it's not right or wrong, but it is extreme. And because it's extreme, you can relate to it. But what people who aren't autistic and sometimes find it hard to understand is that an autistic person living in Limerick, living here their whole lives, getting on a bus, going into a classroom, going into a job interview, might be as much of a culture shock for that person as literally a scenario like this would be for you. But the other side of it is that I think even though we've seen this and it looks pretty stressful, most of us would probably like to get to Tokyo at some stage. But if we went, we'd want a tour guide, we'd want a map, we might decide to use a taxi instead of taking a train. And in the same way, autistic people want and can do the same things as other people, but it's those accommodations that are made to support or aren't made to support that can be the difference between a person having a very positive experience and a very overloading experience. Because I think one thing that it's worth saying, if we kind of get that idea of culture shock, I don't know how well you can see the image that I have on the wall there, but it's an image of Dublin Airport, you know, where there's the long travellators and there's the hard floor next to it. And the experiences I had as an autistic teenager that I think are shared by lots of other autistic people who I've met over the last many years has been that it's a really challenging transition, that moment when you leave childhood or begin to leave childhood and are slowly becoming an adult. And the best way I can explain it is it feels like suddenly a big gap opens up. So whereas maybe you and your peers used to be able to just manage fine, maybe parents mediated it a little bit, all of a sudden there's this gap opens up. And on the one hand, every teenager, every young person, every young adult kind of just wants to be the same, wants to fit in. But in order for you to engage with that as an autistic person, you also have to accept all of the change that goes with being a teenager. The more independence, the breaking rules, the pushing boundaries. So it's a very, very confusing time where on the one hand, the gap opens up, and on the other hand, you're trying to close it. And I suppose one of the realities is when you become an autistic adult, I've already explained about you suddenly have to be able to advocate for yourself. But there is also the whole area of, you know, adults are a lot less accepting and understanding of other adults than they are of other children. There's the reality that often autistic people, for example, when you think about leaving school and deciding where you're going to go to, are you going to go to college? Are you going to access a HSE service? Are you going to go to a PLC course? People are often not given the decision. The decision is made for them. Or in many instances, what happens is people are asked to make decisions out of context. So you get brought to this lovely open day somewhere, and it's really exciting, and it in no way resembles what your first day will look like. So we need to give people much more opportunities to have these experiences in context. But there is positives to growing up as well. You know, one of my earliest memories, so when I was in preschool, I used to be very, very overwhelmed, and my poor mom was my preschool teacher as well as being up all night with me, so she didn't have it easy either. But I used to barricade myself into a corner of the preschool every morning that I would call my kingdom. and people could only come in if they had the password, which was problematic because only I had the password and it was in front of the bathroom. But one of the things was, and because we have video footage of this, when I used to do that, and I only did it when I became quite stressed, people would pick me up and put me back in the middle of the scenario. And then for many years later, when I was probably about 10, 11, and I started being brought to various different therapies, one of the strategies they started trying to teach me was, now, if you become very overwhelmed, you should really get away from other people instead of actually exploding in the middle. So there's a reality that sometimes when autistic people are children, the person mightn't have the language to explain to you why they're doing something, but that doesn't mean that the person isn't doing something for a very good and valid reason for them. And sometimes, because of this normal, we actually unteach coping mechanisms that really help somebody. But I think there's a lot of positive things about becoming an autistic adult as well, if they're resourced and supported properly. You know, as I was saying, there's more of an opportunity to advocate for yourself, to curate your own life, to use the coping mechanisms that perhaps weren't accepted when you were a child. There's more of an opportunity to find your own tribe, you get past that pressure of being a teenager. And in an ideal world, you know, as a child, you're always trying to, even in a really inclusive school, you're trying to fit into a structure. And as an autistic adult, you should be supported and you should be empowered to make your own structure, as opposed to fit into something like a school system, which is always going to have certain demands on people that can be challenging. So, you know, the reality is for autistic people, sometimes to get to the same destination, different routes or different supports are needed. Because I spoke at the start about people speaking a little bit slowly or a little bit loudly. I'll just develop that a little bit more. I think sometimes the fears of autistic adults, and this has come through in a lot of the surveys and the research that we've done, is that people will respond in one of a number of ways when people begin to share what their needs are. So first of all, to remind ourselves that autism doesn't look like anything. We all have an image in our head, and it might be the first person you ever supported. It might be the person in your family. It might be Greta Thunberg. We all have an image in our head. And that isn't a bad thing, and it helps us to understand. But what we have to begin to really embrace is that just as everyone in this room is very different, every autistic person is very different as well. And how we respond when a person shares that information with us for the first time is really, really important. Because sometimes what we get is the response of the Superman. So a person wants to come to you and saying they're having one particular difficulty. And then what the person says is, right, well, I'm just going to take care of you. And it's meant often in the very best way, but it is a paternalistic approach. And what it actually means is very often people get no support instead of the sort of targeted support that they might really need and appreciate. The X-ray man. So because I met one autistic person once, I know what you need. I can see through you and I can see how autistic you are and what specific needs that you have. The judge, I already mentioned that one. And this is the worst one. The bar stool expert. So very often when I finish talks and I have to go from one place to another, and you get into a taxi and somebody says to you, so what do you work as? I learned very early on never to tell somebody that you work for an autism charity, because everyone has their own theory, their own study they read in the tabloid newspaper the week before, or wants to impart information that just isn't appropriate. You know, it's the other person's story, and you really need to let the person talk and let the person decide what they want to share. So just, I suppose, to what I just think is interesting to this whole area of positive risk-taking, one of the things AsIAm has tried to do is if we think judgment and attitude is a barrier, which we do, it's something that we should actually be measuring. What does the public think about autistic people and how does that play out? So every World Autism Month, we survey a representative sample of the Irish public. We use a polling company to do it. And we ask people a whole range of questions. And we start off by asking people, you know, have you heard of autism? Do you know somebody who is autistic? But we build it up to quite intrusive questions. So, for example, would you work with somebody who's autistic? Would you go on a date with somebody who is autistic? If somebody was in your child's school and had a meltdown, should they be punished? So we ask these sorts of questions to really get a sense of what people think. And what comes through really importantly is that people definitely are more aware than ever before. 8 in 10 people say they're aware of autism as a clinical diagnosis. I also don't think we're doing that badly, because I was just back from the Autism Europe Congress in Germany in Krakow at the weekend, and there was a German paper that showed that 43% of psychotherapists in Germany still believe vaccines cause autism. So I think we've made progress on the awareness, which is really positive, but it doesn't mean we've made progress on the understanding. So what we found is when we ask those more divisive questions, people are a lot more evenly split. And what that's probably linked to is a low level of confidence. So only 4% of people think they have a good understanding. But there's two things that I think are really important and bode well for the future. One of them is that when somebody knows somebody who's autistic, they are much more likely to point to positive attributes than negative attributes. So if somebody doesn't know someone who's autistic, they talk about eye contact, they talk about behavior, they might mention words like violence. If you talk to somebody who knows someone who's autistic, they might talk about special interests, they might talk about focus, they might talk about concentration. But the other thing that I think is, so the voices of autistic people matter. I think that's really what I take from that. And I think the second thing that's important is, sometimes when we talk about inclusion in our schools, a question we still get asked from time to time is, but what about the other children? Will that be a good thing or a bad thing for them? And what's very interesting, the 18 to 25-year-old cohort that we asked this question to, who have all gone to school with autistic people and people with other disabilities, across every question, they had positive attitudes, from do I have an autistic friend, through to would I hire or work with somebody who's autistic? So this is a shifting debate, and I think that's a really good thing to see, and it bodes well for the future. What I do have to say is we then ask very similar questions of our own community, and what people think they know and what people think they do doesn't always equate with what the experience is on the ground. And when we think again about decision making, some of these questions are answers from our community, I think, are really important. So 54% of people believed that in the last year they had experienced discrimination as a result of the fact that they were on the autism spectrum. 27% of people said that they didn't feel safe in their own community, they felt unsafe. 63% of people did not believe the healthcare system was accessible for autistic people. So there is a disconnect between the experiences that people are having in their lives and what people think is happening. And what I think is the missing piece, and comes back to the theme of today's discussion, is we need to listen to autistic people more. Often society thinks it's a better place to make decisions, but actually what we can see is that society's understanding maybe doesn't always capture the lived experience and what that's like for somebody on a day-to-day basis. What I do just want to highlight, and it's been mentioned already this morning, is that when we have this debate, it's really important that we don't see things stopping and starting at autism, or indeed stopping and starting at disability. We have a very, very divergent community, and that includes mental health, but it also includes membership of the LGBTQ+ community. It includes, obviously, women who've been typically underrepresented. Worryingly, it includes a lot of people who are homeless, who are prisoners, who are members of ethnic minorities, such as the traveller community, who have never gotten a diagnosis, but who have these support needs. And we were involved in a piece of research for the NDA, for example, last year, that showed a significantly higher representation of autistic adults amongst the homeless population. One of the things that I think is really important, and it comes to the point that I was making a little bit earlier on, it is important that if we are going to support autistic people to take risks, and if we're going to empower autistic people to make our own decisions, there needs to be work and support in developing autistic voice as well. There is that huge stigma out there, but it's little ways as well. How can people have their voices heard? So, for example, the single biggest barrier for many autistic people is the only way they can access healthcare is by ringing up their GP on the telephone. There's a large cohort of people who aren't able to do that. People get standardised letters from Revenue or from other government departments that people aren't able to read, or that people find really intimidating and overwhelming, so just put to one side and let them develop into problems. There's that piece that people are being asked to make decisions on the spot, but the person needs time to process that information, to consider it, and to come back. And there's the reality that many autistic people still don't, in fact, know what our rights are. And one of the things AsIAm is doing at the minute is rolling out self-advocacy training to help autistic adults get a greater understanding of that. If we want to support people and people to feel comfortable in making decisions and taking risks, we have to challenge ourselves about how we talk about autism and disability as a starting point. So I go to so many conferences and I'm asked to speak about maybe, let's say, autistic self-esteem. And then the conference of the title of the conference will be about autism spectrum disorder. So how can you on the one hand tell somebody it's great to be autistic, and on the next hand refer to somebody having a disorder? So the language we use really does matter and is really relevant. So we just need to think a lot more about, I often think that when you think about an autistic adult and when a person's accessing services, sometimes it's nearly like a snag list that is described to somebody, struggles with this, won't do this, can't do this, really finds that very hard. And aside from not working, because you need to be focusing on a person's strengths, the other reality is it's impacting on a person's self-esteem and confidence the whole time as well. I think it's also important to recognise that in this discussion, it's important to support autistic people to engage in their own differences and identities. We know that autistic people who feel confident in their identity tend to have much better outcomes and be in a much happier place than people who aren't aware of their diagnosis or don't accept it. But I think what that also comes back to is understanding those more complicated parts, like we said, that it not being one-dimensional, but also the reality that many autistic people can mask their experiences very, very well, but with very, very bad results. That yes, people might seem to be managing really well on the surface, but just underneath that surface, the person's paddling really, really hard all day, has no energy for anything else, and very often the thicker the mask, the more serious the impact on mental health in the long run. One of the things that I think is interesting in this debate, and obviously as an organisation that tries to provide a voice for both autistic people and the parents of autistic people, we know that some of the changes that are coming are scary for families. And I think that the most important thing that I think I would share on this is that what professionals really need to do is proactively try to win with trust to families. Because unfortunately, from a very early stage, whether it's accessing a diagnosis, whether it's applying for 20 schools to get a school place, whether it's being turned down for your disability allowance or your carer's allowance deliberately multiple times before you ultimately win the application, families have no reason to trust any arm of the state. And you're often dealing with a cohort of people who are neurodivergent themselves, diagnosed or undiagnosed, or who often, like my mother, haven't slept in a very long period of time. So what's very important, I think, is that people have to proactively try and win trust. And I think that's the basis of positive conversations moving forward. And I'm coming near the end now. I suppose I did just mention the environment as well and its impact on people. And it's sometimes something that is thrown in at the end as opposed to being seen as something that will be really central to whether a person's able to be independent and able to make a decision or not. And it's funny because sometimes around the country, when a new autism class gets open, I get asked to come and say a few words. And now when I do, I send out guidelines in advance because I began to notice kind of some very funny but very innocent things. So what would very often happen is we would all cram into a very small room to open the autism class. Then we'd invite the great and good of the village there and it would be really loud. Then they'd bring in platters of sandwiches and coffee, so there's lots of smell in the room. Then they'll hand me a microphone with feedback on it. And I'll be in front of balloons and half the autistic children want the balloons and half of them are worried they're going to burst. Then fourth class come in and play the tin whistle badly. And by the end of the ceremony, I'm the only autistic person still in the room because everybody else has had to be taken out. And then there's usually a kind of Father Ted moment at the end where everyone kind of goes, right, well, that went great. Because nobody connects what's just happened, because for every neurotypical person, the environment has seemed really calm. So people think about autistic people and overstimulation, and they think about the All-Ireland final day in Croke Park, but they don't realise that a room that seems totally calm to you can be really overstimulating for autistic people. And I suppose, just to give an example, I think, to that, and again, it comes back to affirming people in the decisions that they make, is that if you think about it, we all have gotten used to using PPE in recent years, washing our hands, wearing gloves, wearing masks, and autistic people need sensory PPE often at a very early stage. And whether that's a person who's stimming in order to self-regulate, whether that's a person using a particular piece of equipment, we should be really encouraging and affirming that when someone finds something that works for them. Because still what I get asked the most is, how can I what do I do when somebody has a meltdown? What I'd like to be asked a lot more is, how do we stop the meltdown happening in the first place? And really, I think what that comes to is we moving away from trying to change the person and towards actually trying to change society. So I am going to wrap up there. I'm going to leave my slides because I have a little bit more knowledge, but I'm just conscious of time. And I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you very much.